This is Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. Since 2014, the government of China, under the leadership of Xi Jinping, has incarcerated more than 1 million Muslims in internment camps without any legal process. Some experts estimate that in the past 5 years, 16,000 mosques have been damaged or razed to the ground, and hundreds of thousands of kids have been separated from their parents and sent to boarding schools. This campaign is specifically targeted against the Uyghurs, an ethnic minority in northwest China. The political concept of social harmony dates back to ancient China. Harmony and prosperity are two key elements of the social bargain the government promises to its people, the same way the U.S. Constitution promises us free speech, privacy, and other rights that are a part of our societal bargain. So what happens when harmony is held above all else as a value, or when people are harmonized against their will? Nury Turkel is the first U.S.-educated Uyghur-American lawyer, foreign policy expert, and human rights advocate. In 2020, Nury was one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. He was born in a re-education camp, spent the first few months of his life there, and first came to the U.S. as a student in 1995. Nury recently wrote a book based on extensive first-person interviews with survivors. We talked about all of this, and we hope you find the conversation as informative as we did. As a reminder, like all of our episodes, this is an edited version of a longer conversation with audience questions. If you'd like to ask one of our upcoming guests a question or hear past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode coming this Monday. Our co-founders Justin Higgins and John Gunnison led the interview. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
Nury, why did you write this book? What compelled you to just write a book, which is a very big undertaking?
The reason that I wrote this book, most importantly, I believe in the power of storytelling. You have to tell your own story. I wanted to illustrate through the stories that I told in my book, including the camp survivors, to explain that this has been an ongoing repression by the Chinese Communist government. I also wanted to make this issue relatable to general audience, particularly American people, that we can no longer ignore this is another human rights crisis or human rights problem. Anything that you touch today in our stores, reportedly made by enslaved Uyghurs.
What was the most surprising thing that you found during the process of researching and reaching out to people working on this book? What surprised you, scared you, shocked you the most?
It was striking to uncover specifics of the similarities between the CCP atrocities and the CCP and Nazi mindset, including collective punishment based on religious and ethnic identity, rounding up social elites, thought leaders, and violence against women and children, dehumanization of an entire ethnic group or population. I spent a substantial amount of time to study Nazi Germany, the history of concentration camps throughout history. I was disturbed to the extent that there's so much similarities between the CCP mindset and that of the Nazi. That is one of the most surprising aspects of this project. Additionally, the disturbing nature of the technology-enabled authoritarianism and the world's indifference to another genocide. This is a tech genocide, if I may use that term. There is also a massive failure regarding an early detection and prevention of atrocity crimes. And also, I, as a father of 2 young kids, and as somebody who had a chance to talk to camp survivors, I was surprised to learn the severity of the targeted attack on the Uyghur women and children.
So, Nury, before we go any further, I kind of want to get into some of the historical context so the audience understands how we got here. So, the events that we're discussing are happening in what's called the Xinjiang Autonomous Region. It's also sometimes called Eastern Turkestan. This is an enormous region. I think it's the largest region in all of China. Could you tell us how did the Xinjiang province end up under the control of the Chinese?
The Uyghurs have had independent states twice. However, it was short-lived republics. The first time was in 1933. The second time was in 1944. The Second Republic, particularly relevant to today's discussion, was established with the help of Soviet Union. After the end of the civil war in China, Stalin and Mao decided to split up the Central Asian region. And Stalin realized that there's much more closeness and ideological front aligning with Mao. So in 1949, several key leaders, senior leadership in the Second East Turkestan Republic, was on their way to decide or discuss, negotiate the final status of the Uyghur homeland, East Turkestan. They disappeared initially, and then there was a air crash reported. So they died in this mysterious air crash over the skies of today's Kazakhstan. And after that, the Soviets and the Chinese sent their own leadership. In the early 50s, they established the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. The name Xinjiang is literary translation of that name is New Dominion, New Territory. Today, the Uyghur people prefer to refer to their homeland as East Turkestan for that historical reasons. That is a sign of their longing for political sovereignty, independence, if you like. It's a kind of shows a nostalgia to the political and independent state that Uyghur ancestors were established in 1944. In the early period, during the period that I was born, the Uyghur intellectuals, much like today, were rounded up and sent to labor camps and re-education camps. Shortly after 9/11, China claimed that Chinese state is also a victim of global terrorism. After that, we also experienced tightening up.
Before we get into that, we will be asking about these different eras that you're outlining. Could you explain how the demographics have changed since the People's Republic of China established the autonomous region back when you were talking about the partition between Stalin, and how just the nature of the demographics of the region have shifted?
The demographic shift has been dramatic, to say the least. Around the time that the Stalin delivered the Uyghur homeland to Mao in a silver platter, the Uyghur population was the majority. Reportedly, there are approximately 4% of the population were ethnic Han Chinese. And today in the capital city, Urumqi, reportedly more than 80% of the population are Han Chinese. In the region, it is hard to ascertain exact population figure. Even if you use the figure put out by the Chinese government, the Han Chinese population is almost half of the total population today.
Nury, we're talking about the names of the region, how local people like to refer to it as East Turkestan, and China have called it Xinjiang. The other aspect of the name that the Chinese give is rather curious to me. They call it the Xinjiang Autonomous Region. And I hear these stories of incredible repression, and it doesn't sound to me like there is much self-governing happening. So is that a misnomer, the idea of an autonomous region of Xinjiang? And has it always been?
The name, actually, the official name is Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, like Tibet Autonomous Region and Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region, Ningxia Hui Autonomous Region. They have several autonomous regions. But the local people never able to run their own affairs, even though there's nicely written constitutional autonomy law and propaganda documents clearly state that the local people should be able to maintain their social, cultural affairs. Just give you one example. If the Chinese really follow their own rules and regulations, they wouldn't have this kind of religious repression, the banning the language, restricting people to go into places of worship to practice their religion. If you look at the excuses, the official line, and much of it targeted to Uyghur ethno-national identity. Under the autonomy laws, those things supposed to be protected. So when I looked at the Hong Kong people suffer to the extent that they have today, it just showed a similarity, striking similarities. They just give this fake autonomy, and then when they decide to take it away, they take it away with the state violence.
Is there a special strategic importance to this region for the government of China that maybe has resulted in them taking a different approach and a more repressive approach to different cultures in that region than they may otherwise take.
When you look at the geographic location of Uyghur homeland, it is in the heart of Central Asia. It has over 600 miles international border. It makes 1/6 of the China proper, 4 times the size of the state of California, the size of Western Europe. It sits in a large oil and gas reserve. It has rich minerals, including rare earth, and it also has a vast agricultural sector that supplies tomato, reportedly, and other agricultural products, including cotton, to the global supply chain today. That is the economic significance to the Chinese state. And geographically speaking, this piece of territory is a gateway to Eurasia, a Eurasian market, and Eurasian natural resources. As you know, that stability is a paramount concern to the Chinese state. In order to accomplish their geopolitical goals, global dream, regional influence operations, they need to make this area stable. The stability means they will do anything to keep heavy grip on the region. So what do? They need to target the Uyghur ethno-national identity, religion in particular, way of life, and now they're even meddling the Uyghurs' love affairs, relationship with the marriage. They even punish, based on the 2007 de-extremification measure, targeting the Uyghur women who refused to marry Han Chinese individuals.
A Chinese study produced for senior officials says labor transfers help assimilate Uyghur minorities, transform their thinking and reduce Uyghur population density. The study was posted online in error. Some of Xinjiang's mainly Muslim minorities are sent first to the giant re-education camps where China says it's fighting extremism, then to the factories. Very few have managed to leave China after their release.
There were 200 workers in the factory. We sold children's clothes and we are obliged to sing the Chinese national anthem. They said, the faster you work, the faster we'll let you go.
This is just an unprecedented authoritative source written by really leading academics and former government officials with unprecedented high-level access in Xinjiang itself. That drives home the implications of what is going on here. There are higher goals of manipulating population density and demographics that, in my opinion, are very concerning, and they really point us towards crimes against humanity.
I want to get into the period from 2007 to 2014, then 2014 to 2017, then 2017 to present. But before we get to there, you've been mentioning that the repression has been going on for a long time and that the leadership is concerned about stability. I think it would help clarify things if you could explain how the mindset of the Chinese government was from the 70s to, the turn of the century, and then how it changed after 9/11, assuming that it did change.
There was certain level of loosening up in the 1980s. I grew up in the heart of Central Asia, a city, Kashgar. That's where I was born and raised. In Kashgar, when I was growing up, I was able to follow my father to attend significant religious holidays, like prayer services at major mosques. And I was able to speak my own language. But this kind of cultural revival, loosening up, only went through the Tiananmen Square pro-democracy movement. After Hu Yaobang's death, after the Tiananmen Square massacre, and then after the end of the Cold War, the Chinese government turned this Uyghur homeland essentially a police state initially. They have this term called preemptive policing, which has been more evident today. But then they were looking for thought leaders, if you a poet, writer, or teacher, a university professor, if you just sounded too political, if you display sense of nationalism, national identity, the Uyghurness, then the Chinese security go after you. But if you just go about with your life, enjoying or practicing your religion, as long as you don't meddle in politics, you were left alone. I think the major shift really started with Xi Jinping took office. Even though all types of political repression, forced disappearances, torture, long imprisonment, targeting Uyghur youth in the early periods of 2010, they started restricting normal religious practices, specifically to Uyghur children and women and state employees. So this has been a gradual change, but I can't speak for the Chinese government, how they end up creating this open-air prison-like environment as described by the State Department. But what I can say is that this has a lot to do with a racist approach.
Nury, you mentioned the elevation of Xi Jinping to the highest offices in China as a key turning point in this repression, but you also pointed at Tiananmen Square in 1989 and September 11th, 2001 as other key moments that brought us down this path. So I'm wondering, Nury, was there much consciousness about the plight of Uyghur people during those periods? Did the United States and others know or care about what was happening throughout the 1990s and the first part of the 2000s?
I came to the United States in 1995. When I came during that time, during the process of even applying for asylum, it's even difficult to find a newspaper article that shows that the Uyghur people have been subject to political repression. And today, there are a wealth of information publicly available, a lot of governmental documents published. But again, as I noted, the United States government not only did not speak out or pay attention until this turned into a genocidal actions, they also willfully ignored, specifically during the Clinton era and onward. During the Clinton presidency, that was the time that I started living in the United States. People are so fixated with the idea of having a trade relationship, helping Chinese to set up this manufacturers, assembly lines that we find out today are using slave labor. And then during the Bush era, some policymakers in the United States government mistakenly and naively believed that China can be a partner in the war on global terrorism. And then during the Obama era, there was an engagement that take it to the next level. There were a lot of love and affection expressed to Xi Jinping, including by our president Biden, who then was the vice president. And this build up, if you look back, the timeline actually started in the second Obama term. So the United States not only missed opportunity to highlight human rights in its engagement with China, but also kind of in a way allowed the Chinese to build up today's nightmare. I am very comfortable in calling U.S. government out, particularly 9/11, listening to the Chinese and making certain concessions, enlisting an obscure Uyghur organizations, terrorist organization, namely East Turkestan Islamic Movement, designated as a terrorist organization. I did not even know the existence of such an organization. My not knowing is not such a big deal, but a lot of people who were living in that part of the world did not even hear about this name. And Secretary Pompeo in late 2020 revoked that designation. So there have been some corrections done in our part in a governmental level, but the damage has been done. This is why I feel so compelled to push this responsibility over to the Europeans and American policymakers to do something to stop the ongoing genocide. If we took any action, specifically the period that you were citing, we may have prevented some of this. We may not be able to prevent all of it, but we may have been able to prevent some of it.
When we're talking about the separatist movement, I think the period that we're thinking of is maybe 2007 to 2014. What were some of the acts of these separatists? And again, we're asking this with the understanding that there is absolutely no way to justify internment camps and genocide that is currently going on. When the Chinese government mentions terrorism, what verifiable acts have been going on that we can look at and we know it's true and not made up?
The Chinese have this slogan, fight against three forces, separatism, extremism, and terrorism. There is no clear distinction between those or for those three loaded terminology. So for separatism, for example, the Ilham Tohti professor at Minzu University, who was sent to life imprisonment, was accused of possessing separatist ideology. He was a professor at the state university. He was a peaceful I don't like this term moderate voice in China, as if there's a bunch of radicals. So he was a moderate voice that the Chinese government should have been elevated to important position to even run the regional affairs. But he's serving life sentence after being accused by the state for separatism. But this is very important that your listeners, the participants in this conversation, need to be reminded of. In China, there's a thing called preemptive policing. You don't have to commit a crime. If the government believes or perceives that you're a threat, you're taken into the camp. It's like Tom Cruise's Minority Report movie scene. Essentially, when you look at the leaked documents, it's all about preemptive policing. It's all about personal data collection. It's all about screening. It's about surveillance. It's about them, the machine, making the judgment that this person may potentially become a threat. Therefore, that person needs to be sent to the camp. And there's a slogan, you cannot clear out the weeds one by one. You have to spray chemicals.
At this factory, the Uyghur workers are clearly visible. More than 2,000 miles from home, brought all the way to central China by a massive relocation scheme. Now the BBC has found compelling evidence of how it works. In this Xinjiang village, the authorities need 100 people to send to jobs on the other side of the country. They set up a stall, but this 2017 state media report shows no one's interested. So they go house to house. If you stay here, this official says, you'll be married soon and never be able to leave. Will you go, he asks. No, she says. But with a mixture of propaganda and heavy persuasion, the young woman eventually agrees. I'll go if others go, she says.
Nury, they used quotas, right? I mean, that shows how this is entirely preemptive, correct? They have targets where certain villages in Xinjiang, 1% of the village must be arrested and so on, right?
Yeah. The ICIJ, International Consortium on Investigative Journalism, put out China Cable. And I cited this in my book. There is a period in 10 days in the summer of 2017, a village security apparatus received the order to round up 20,000 people. And their database did not find those 20,000 people. They showed 16, and then they were pressured. They added another 1,000. In just 10 days alone, in one village, 17,000 people's lives are shattered. So no one even asked to this day if that kind of collective punishment, relying on integrated joint operating platform, to round up people based on their travel history, based on their family connection, based on their past writing, based on their education, based on their finances, based on how much electricity that person used, based on how many times that person prayed, is all generated by machine. And even to this day, no one bothered to ask if that's even an effective method, even if they wanted to, re-educate the public. This re-education involves individuals with 2 PhDs. What kind of people would need to go through a language learning, brainwashing sessions, religious belief denunciation sessions with loaded degrees? Like we're talking about former president of Xinjiang University, who has an honorary degree from France and PhD from Japan.
The civil servant family pair-up. Can you get into what that was and how this mindset shifted yet again how the CCP government was approaching the Uyghur people?
This pairing now is a relative program. Homestay, they have different names. Professor Darren Byler wrote about this a couple of years ago. I've also talked about this in my book. This is not some European or Asian exchange student coming to your home to stay with you and learn the local culture. This is a government-sponsored Chinese communist project, comes to your house to surveil, spy, and even sexually assault female individuals in the house. I interviewed several Uyghurs who had a first-hand experience with this kind of program. It's still ongoing. And there's no way that you can say no So essentially, they are assigning Chinese cadres to come to your house uninvited, eat and sleep with you. The survivors of those horrific treatment told me about. Through that interview, through my own investigation, research, and reading, something hit me so hard, which was using the children to spy on their parents. So essentially, these people come to their homes, the homes of the Uyghurs, and make the Uyghur kids to spy on their parents. Questions like, do they pray when we're not around? What do they say when we're not around? Do they tell you to act a certain way and talk in a certain way? Kids are honest. And some of those kids' honest answers, I don't have a statistical figure to share with you, but I'm pretty confident that some of those honest answers lended some of the parents to places that they should not be taken into. It's not an exaggeration when Randy Shriver said that the US government believes about 3 million Uyghurs have been taken into the camp is not an exaggeration. This has also have been identified by a Chinese student in Vancouver, Xinjiang, that I also profiled in my book, who used his technical skills to identify physical location of the camps. Some of the camps is the size of 150 soccer fields.
Nury, just because you mentioned this student was using technology to try to address and assess the emergency, the tragedy, it reminded me of something that you said earlier on in the program tonight, which was that the Uyghur genocide is a tech genocide. And I think in your last response, you were giving us some illustration of how that works, how technology is being used by the Chinese state to exercise and implement this tragedy. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? I want to know, is this totally unique in history? I mean, are they using technology in this situation in a way that has never been used to commit acts of genocide and cultural erasure?
The magnitude, the seriousness of the tech surveillance in China should concern us. I'm not speaking under my official capacity today, but I also am a government official. Through my government position, I helped to organize a hearing inviting experts in technology sector to tell us what is really happening in Chinese tech sector, especially in the surveillance part of the technology business in China. So based on what we learned, at least 83 countries in late 2020 have adopted Chinese surveillance techniques that have been either financed by the Chinese government or offered, or some instances procured by those governments that also have a problem with their own people. So these technology firms supplying these techniques includes Huawei, ZTE, Hikvision, SenseTime, iFlyTech. If you look at the lockdown today in reportedly more than 40 cities, the rough figure shows around 300 million people been in lockdown. This was something that I've been cautioning, I've been telling the world, using whatever the platform available, that people should not be fantasized by this contact tracing, this intrusive form of surveillance. The reasons that I stated compelled the United States government, starting from late 2019, to add Chinese technology firms to Commerce Department's entity list. As we speak, there have been more than 100 punitive sanctions announced by the United States government that includes the entity list designation. And when you look at those companies, that includes most of the major Chinese firms that the United States business entities are prohibited providing technology, hardware, software.
Nury, as part of the internment in these concentration camps, we spoke to a survivor, and you mentioned that they're messing with children, forcing inter-ethnic marriages. They're also, from the survivor we spoke to, they're carrying out forced sterilization. Can you get into the brainwashing and the chemical cocktail that you uncovered in your book?
The other piece is also being discussed in my book, is this mysterious pill or medicine that they make the female detainees in particular to take. I don't have a permission to disclose the medical history of the individuals that I discussed, but what I know is one of the interviewees, the lady that you mentioned, Zumrat Dawood, publicly stated that she's no longer able to conceive. This is in public. This has been reported. And also, one other piece is very important. Last December, around the time that I got sanctioned by China, the Biden administration added China's Military Medical Academy and its 11 affiliates to the entity list, Commerce Department's entity list, for developing brain control weaponry. This has been reported in Financial Times, that you can look it up. So what does this tell us? So anyone cannot tell me, specifically me, with a straight face, that this is not a genocide and China is fighting war on terrorism. You don't fight war on terrorism by separating 800 to 1 million children from their parents and sending them to state-run orphanage. And you don't fight the terrorism or separatism by using this kind of brain control weaponry. And you don't fight terrorism or separatism by purposefully, deliberately preventing natural population growth by 25% in 1 year.
Throughout this conversation, you've been remarking a little bit on what the Biden administration and the U.S. have been doing with sanctions and other measures to try to address this tragedy. Certainly, it seems as though the issue is more and more on the consciousness of the U.S. government, and we've certainly been talking about it more. But it does sometimes seem as though no matter what we do, it makes almost no difference to the people who are stuck in, as you described, an open-air prison. Do you think that there are any policy measures that we can take that will actually make life better for the Uyghur people?
We need to put in place regulatory administrative measures, both here in the United States and Europe, to tackle this tech genocide. How the technology sector, both in Europe and the United States, in a way, funding and facilitating the Chinese technology that have been enabling the Chinese state to carry out this genocide. This is something that has not received enough attention. So I would like to see EU and United States to put in place legislative mandate to address tech authoritarianism. And then two, I would like to see the recently enacted Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act to be fully enforced. Arguably, this bill, this bipartisan bill, is the most significant, in my mind, significantly done by the United States Congress since China joined the WTO. Without addressing this issue, I don't think that we will be able to talk about broader supply chain problem or cleaning. Today, more than 80 global brands that includes solar panel, that includes PPEs that we use to save lives, protect ourselves from COVID, and also some of the beauty products, consumer products, agricultural products, computer components reportedly made by Uyghur slaves. So without full implementation, the United States government or our partners and allies will not be able to stop this genocide. And finally, this is something also very important, that the consumers, early this year during the Winter Olympics in Beijing, there was a call by the activists to not to watch the games. As a result of that campaign, the viewership of NBC broadcast of the games dropped nearly 50%. That's a big money loss for a corporate entity. If the consumers start putting back products, particularly the agricultural product, cotton product, electronic components made or electronic equipments made in China back to the shelf, I think the corporate boardrooms will be hearing from us. Whatever is happening today in the slave labor area has created a huge legal, reputational, and investment risk. Some of the listeners may not like this. American people, European people funding the ongoing genocide.
That concludes today's conversation. Again, huge thanks to Nury Turkel, to our audience for their questions, and most of all, to you for being here. Like all of our episodes, this is an edited version of a longer conversation with real audience questions. If you would like to ask one of our upcoming guests a question or hear past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode coming this Monday. This has been Politics and Media 101. Wherever you are in the world, thank you for being a part of this community. I'm Jeff Browning on behalf of Justin Higgins and John Gunnison, our co-founders. We hope to hear from you soon.